I was going to start this by sort of talking how privileged I was to be here, ladies and gentlemen, and everything, but I was intercepted on the way in, and somebody said, no, the way you greet people is like this. You go, I love you, like that. And that's apparently a Bollywood thing of saying how to do it. It's much better. Does anybody know where that picture comes from? Any other guesses? No. That's from the Korean War. It's from the Korean War. And all these wars look the same, don't they, really? I mean, you can't judge them. And Korea is very much in our thoughts again. And I've been there a couple of times, actually, with the help of UPF, have been in there. And I've got to tell you, it's the wackiest place. It's not really like we hear about it from America. They are the most intelligent, the most funny, the most joking characters I've been with. They drink like a fish. They're completely risque about their jokes. Apparently, South Korea is collapsing because all the women fall in love with North Korean men because they're braver and cleverer than the South Koreans. And this goes around. And then one day we were there talking, having a great time, getting a bit drunk with them in the hotel, and then in the corner there was some Bulgarians playing Hey Jude, the Beatles song. And Hey Jude, like that, going on. And I said, rather sort of singing it, I said, yes, this is a great song. I wonder what would have happened if the Beatles were playing now and what great music they would produce. And our guides, who were laughing and drinking with us, suddenly went like this, and their faces turned to stone. One of them said, Mr. Humphrey, can you come with me? So we went out into a little cubby hole in the hotel. And I said, look, I'm sorry, I know the Beatles, it's a Western. He said, no. The Beatles have not split up. And I said, right. You get used to this in North Korea. The Beatles have not. And he said, the Beatles have not split up because they are coming to play here for our great leader, Kim Il-sung. And Kim Il-sung happened to have died by then. So my thoughts were going a little bit round like that. And I said, okay, right, so that's fine. I won't mention again anything else, I said. And then and just the mask went away and he became human for a second. He said, no, but please be careful because we never know who's watching us. And then we went back to the group. And it works. What I'm going to talk about is not so much the Middle East and all those things that have been on our things, but Asia, because I've been researching a book, which is sort of why I'm here. It hasn't been published yet, and I've come up with strands and themes that make me very afraid about what's happening in Asia and how it's not being addressed. Because Asia is the place where things are happening. It's where real powers are being created. It's not suicide bombers and IEDs by the side of the road. It's not tribal warfare that has racked and enveloped our concentration for the past 16 years or so. It's about governments wrestling for power. It's also why I've called it Asian Waters, is because this is going to be a maritime struggle for power. Whereas Europe, with Russia invading Ukraine, the fall of Berlin, the checkpoint Charlie and the Berlin Wall and all of that sort of thing, these have been land wars fought trench by trench. The Pacific Wars, as this is, it's going to be a maritime conflict. Whoops, wrong way. And I just want to go back because this is one element that has been on our minds over the summer. And it's a very different element. We might be afraid, justifiably, of a bomb going off in a tube train because of what's happening in the Middle East, but not half as terrifying as a missile reaching Guam, Hawaii, or San Francisco from North Korea. The psychology of warfare over the next few years is going to change from where we've been for the past 15 years to where we are heading. And what I've done is I've identified 5 trigger points, all in the Asia-Pacific region. And they are, the thing about them is that these are quite recent problems that are unresolved. So if you look at this, the South China Sea problem is probably the oldest, and it dates back to 1839 when Britain roared in with its gunboats and invaded southern China to sell narcotics. It raised its head back again in 2013 when China felt strong enough to build its defenses in the South China Sea, which I'll get to in a minute. The Taiwan Straits, that dates back to 1949, quite recent, unresolved. Korea, which I've just talked about, 53, or 1945, when, like Germany, it was split in two with the Soviet influence or control of the north and the US control of the south. India and China, that were meant to be two neighbors who had thrown off the shackles of colonialism and occupation and growing up as the powers of Asia, but in fact they fought a war in 1962, and just a few weeks ago their armies were at standoff against each other in a similar area because of an unresolved dispute. China and Japan, 1931, and again in 2012, when a row blew up over islands and there were riots on the mainland in Japan. I'm going to deal with each of these very briefly. It's not going to be a comprehensive thing, but then the strands that are bringing this whole thing, whoops, wrong way again. So this area that I'm looking at now is actually called not the Asia-Pacific, but the Indo-Pacific. And if that thing works, just on the Horn of Africa there is China's first overseas military base in Djibouti. And its influence stretches through, some of you may have heard of the String of Pearls, which is a number of ports, not in India, but Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Burma, Pakistan, where it's sort of creating its supply routes through the Indian Ocean, and then, of course, off to the South China Sea. And then we have Guam, that was in the sights of North Korea, or is in the sights of North Korea, stretching right through to the west coast of the United States. This is the Indo-Pacific region. And if you look at it from China's point of view, it's surrounded. These are the American bases that are surrounding China. And of course now India is joining this. It's joining in with the pro-American Western alliance, along with Japan up here. So you've got Japan and India. You can see how it feels boxed in, can't you? And these are all the bases. China has got no bases at all in such a place. So the first trigger, which I'm going to discuss, is the South China Sea. Now this is a picture from the Opium War Museum in southern China, which tells us the story from the Chinese viewpoint of the Opium Wars. Before I went there, I went to the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, which told the story from our viewpoint of the Opium Wars. Neither of them were inaccurate, but there was a difference of emphasis, obviously. But this is the British coming ashore in November 1839, and it blasted through the defences under the banner of international law, free trade, to prop up the profits of the colonial East India Company, which was losing money at the time, so it had to sell its narcotics into China. A Chinese diplomat who I was discussing with gave me an image of how they see it. And that is, in effect, if you imagine the Mexican drug cartels bursting through into a weakened United States and then insisting that everybody buys cocaine from California to Texas to Louisiana and all the rest of it, and that was all under the name of international law and free trade. He said that's how we feel. And this century of humiliation is embedded in the minds of every Chinese from birth, through kindergarten, through school and university. The century of humiliation lasted from 1842, when they signed the first treaty of the Opium War, up until 1949, which is when Mao threw out the nationalist government. And it is very difficult to have a conversation with any Chinese diplomat or security person for any length of time without this psychology coming up. They feel that because their defenses were not there, they were defeated. Now, before 1842, China was building up, or had built up, what it calls the Great Wall of land, which is not the Great Wall as such, but what it did, it created an arc of buffer states that protected China from foreign invaders. That was Tibet, which it sort of consolidated in the 1950s, Xinjiang, which is now that restless Muslim area, Manchuria, which is up Russia-North Korean borderways, and Mongolia, which is now split in two within a Mongolia in Chinese control, and Mongolia used to be in the Soviet arc during the Cold War. But they didn't get round to doing their Great Wall of the Sea. They went through the Maoist Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward. They didn't have the money or the confidence to do that until around 2009, when it lodged what they call the 9-dash line. And what this has done is, that's the red one there. I've got the laser here. So this is the 9-dash line, and some people, particularly in Vietnam, they call it the cow's tongue. Because you look at the shape of it, you can imagine that tongue hanging out of a cow's mouth, can't you? And they claim that this is their sovereign water, sovereign territory. And all these other lines are the other claimants to it. So you have China claiming Taiwan, obviously, which we get onto in the moment, but the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and if you go up here, you have the disputed islands between China and Japan. Now, this is their building, their equivalent of building the Great Wall of the Sea. So what they've done is they've taken 7 basically rocks or reefs, and they've turned them into military bases on the western side of the eastern side of the South China Sea. And this is Johnson Reef, which is one of them. And these names are interesting because they come from, you can imagine these colonial seafarers and pirates just end up somewhere and plant a flag, and then they call it by their name. So this was Captain Johnson of a ship, and there's Captain Spratley and all the rest of it. Mischief Reef is the one most in the news because if you look at this, is a runway for fighter planes and bombers, and they've now got hangars here where they can keep these planes. And this was Mischief Reef in 1995. So you can see how it's changed. There's really nothing there. It's stilts on rocks under the sea. And the building of these islands only really began in around 2012, 2013, when Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, came to power. So what we're looking at here is a very long-formed, thought-out policy, which takes us by surprise, or we pretend it takes us by surprise, but it's been on the Chinese books for a long time because it ties in completely with, some of you may have heard of his Belt and Road Initiative that was launched with, which is the trade routes through, and the string of pearls through the Indian Ocean and all the rest of it. Now, last year, about a year ago, there was an international tribunal which told China that basically all these things were illegal. And China ignored the rulings of that tribunal. In other words, it challenged international law. And it challenged it for 2 reasons. Firstly, because it's now strong enough to do so. And secondly, because this is what big powers do. And if you go back onto the books, Britain and the US have done that many times in the past and got away with it. So what China is doing now is not abnormal in any way at all. But believe me, as the years go on, the characters in China, the leaders, will be painted by our politicians as evil people as this gets more up. And we have to watch that because that does lead to conflict. The second trigger associated is Taiwan, also embedded in the psychology of the Chinese people. China has to get Taiwan back. It can't do, for example, what we did with Scotland a couple of years ago here and hold a referendum, and yes, if you want to leave Britain, that's fine, and everything will be good. We won't kill each other. This is different. The Communist Party has promised its people that China is going to return, and therefore that is what is going to happen. You can see here, this is about 200 miles, depending where you go to, but here, this is about 2 miles from the Chinese coast. And this is where, in the 1950s, we became within a hair's breadth of there being a Third World War a third nuclear world war that is not widely reported. But in 1958, after Mao had finished with the Korean War, he headed back to try to take back Taiwan and started bombing the island of Jinmin, or Kinmen, depending where you are, heavily with artillery before an invasion. The Americans drew up plans to drop 5 Hiroshima-sized bombs around the city of Xiamen on Chinese military bases and sites. And that reached President Eisenhower's desk to sign off on it. Eisenhower got a message from Khrushchev saying, we will consider an attack on China to be an attack on Russia. And it never happened, but it became that close to happening. And it became that close to happening, interesting, they thought about it during the Korean War, but America didn't think it had enough stockpiles of weapons to do it, to sort of keep going with the nuclear war, but it did by the time 1958 came around. And when Eisenhower was arguing with his generals and Air Force commanders, the army was saying, excuse me, Mr. President, when you're fighting a war, you use the best weapon at your disposal. Eisenhower had to tell them, the general turned president, no, the nuclear weapon is a different type of weapon. We have to put it into a different category. And that was when we began to talk about weapons of mass destruction and other things like that. And Taiwan is also a problem for China, because there it is sitting 1 mile away from its coastline, and it has shown that you can run a vibrant, healthy democracy in a Chinese society, and there is not chaos, and the economy still continues to jump. And that's like every time they look out on that, the Chinese are pushed towards how are they going to do it. And this all came under the American security umbrella, much talked about in Asia, under which China, South Korea, and much of Southeast Asia also benefited, this sort of era of peace that lasted after the Vietnam War up until now. And I just like this photograph because I think that's one of the cluster of the Jinmin Island group, but that's a Taiwanese island up against Xiamen, which is this Chinese sort of futuristic megacity like they all are. And it just shows us that, yeah, without America, without the trade, without this agreement that we've all had in international law, China wouldn't be able to have done what it's done. But it has now, and it, like a kid growing up, it's kicking to get a bigger seat at the table, to have more of a say, and it wants to get injustices like the Century of Humiliation sorted out. Whoops. There we go. Now we go to trigger number 3, which is Japan. These are the Senkaku, or Diaoyu Islands, which are disputed between Japan and China. And it's a little bit, I describe it when I talk to people, it's like, you know, nobody lives there. The Americans couldn't think of anything to do with them apart from use them for bombing practice. And they were owned by a sort of aristocratic Japanese family for years until 2011, 2012. So quite why you've got these two sophisticated economies and global powers fighting or disputing these islands bedevils all of us. It's like two billionaires fighting over an empty bottle of whiskey, really, isn't it? And, you know, but this is what people do. I mean, this is what humanity does. So in 2012, the nationalistic mayor of Tokyo tried to buy the islands off this family, and then the government thought this is a bit dangerous and took control of them themselves. But that was like a red rag to a bull. And these are the anti-Japanese demonstrations that took place in China, allowed by the Communist Party, that destroyed many Chinese businesses, literally burnt down businesses, attacked them, smashed windows and all that sort of thing. The actual result of that was a 40% drop of Japanese investment into China, which made many of us realize something that we hadn't realized before. We had thought that the Indo-Pacific, led by East Asia, was making people richer, building better things, spreading wealth around, and everybody could continue like that, and the human race would be happy. Not so. A bit like here, which we've experienced with the Brexit debate, or over in America, they were quite happy to drop that 40% of Japanese investment in order to prove their point about how they felt to be Chinese. And they wanted to use some obsolete islands to prove it. It takes a bit of thinking about, but it's actually what is going on. And the key thing about where China and Japan comes into this is that if you take what's happening now in Southeast Asia and that with this South China Sea thing, it's an issue really of many of the smaller countries having to cut their deal and compromise with China, because China controls the economy of the region. So if you're Laos, Excellency, or Vietnam, or Cambodia, or the Philippines, every policy you make has to say, how's China going to react to this? How are we going to deal with it? How are we going to be clever about it? And China sees this itself as the mandate from heaven in the Middle Kingdom, and people, leaders from these areas for centuries have come and paid tribute to the emperor. That's how it sees itself, and that's how it's worked, apart from Japan. Japan has never done that, although it's much smaller. And this is Japan in 1853, 10 years after the defeat of the Opium War in China. And America arrived with its gunboats, just as Britain had done. And what Japan did was sign the treaty. There was no war. There was a little bit of this, that, but there was no substantive war. And it invited them in, and you had the latest Ford motor car later on in there, and the fashionable dresses and the music and everything from America came onto the streets of Japanese cities. And they absorbed it, and they learnt from it, and they got on with it. So that in 1905, they had an army strong enough to defeat a European power in the form of Russia in Port Arthur. And by the 1930s, they were challenging the United States. They became too strong too quickly, which led to their defeat in the war, but they played a different game to China. And that is something that's sort of, it's like two football rivals meeting each other, in the dressing room. They sniff around each other and they challenge each other because they know they both want to be the top dog. And this is what's going on at the moment. So who's leading this? It's Abe on the left, Shinzo Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister, and Xi Jinping, and they are not the best of friends because circumstances don't allow them to. But then we have a third in Narendra Modi in India. That's where you cross the Malacca Straits and you cross the Himalayas and you have a whole new ballgame there in Asia. India's now in this blend because it fears Chinese expansion into the Indian Ocean, and with the ports that China has built in Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and the One Belt, One Road project that sort of goes through all that thing, which India is not a part of and has refused to join, you're getting a polarizing element there in Asia. And India is joining, and this is something that was set up in the Bush era, India is joining America, and it's becoming closer to Japan in this. And which brings us to the fourth trigger. And this is a couple of months back where China was building a road through Bhutan that threatened India, at Doklam, the place was called. And you had these two huge armies in a standoff against each other. We didn't hear much about it. You never do. This is two nuclear powers, two big powers of Asia, challenging each other over, again, a scrap of land. Nobody lives up there, or barely. And there they are. This is the Chinese and the Indians, which is more reminiscent of the pictures that we're used to on the Pakistan-China, the Pakistan-India border. We're now getting it up there. This is a very controlled situation at the moment. Not a shot has been fired, not a life has been lost. But it does show, and it was China once again putting down a marker and saying, I am the boss in this part of the world, and you actually need to do what we say. India being very proud itself, but it cannot take on China economically, politically, or militarily. So again, we've got this situation which is slightly more nuanced, but of the vassal state situation, is that how much can India compromise if it's going to stand up to. And there we go. I put this up here because you can see, the font and this was 70 years ago. But still, it's the same issue, unresolved. You've got this stream of issues that have been completely unresolved, dating back to the Second World War, in this case, just after independence. And now the fifth and final trigger is, I think this is a familiar scene to many of you, and it's been one that I've seen many times, and I can tell you it hasn't changed a jot. Those guys have probably grown up or got their pensions by now, but there are new ones in place, and it doesn't move. And again, this is 53, this was all set up, and it's unchanged. And I think that the drum roll of war or drum roll of conflict that's happening is sort of showing that you cannot have these festering, unresolved things going on. This is 1951. Again, you can see, the style. We're in a different age, different people, everything like that. And now you jump forward 70 years, and we're into missile territory. The grandson of the founder, the man who loved the Beatles so much, is targeting America. So, what to do? A small group of us can't do much, but coming through this, there was one thought that constantly struck me, and I asked it at every conference and think tank I went to. This Treaty of San Francisco followed the Second World War, and essentially it was this and other things like the Bretton Woods Agreement and that set up the global architecture that we're in at the moment, the international law, the financial institutions, the World Bank and the IMF. This was the US-Japan military agreement, and all of those things came into being after the Second World War and are still in place. They've lasted fairly well. This was a conference that took place after a global war. Another one, the League of Nations, set up in 1919, a big conference that took place after a global war. The Congress of Vienna, 1815, and we didn't have any photographs for that, so I got someone to do a cartoon, after the Napoleonic Wars, to try to sort out peace in Europe. So a big conference, chandeliers, lots of good wine, after the people had been killed and the cities had been destroyed. Going all the way back to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which is actually, in the view of many, still the system under which we live now in the European democracies. The Treaty of Westphalia was after the 30 Years' War and the Protestant Catholic schism that was sweeping through Europe then. And basically it relied on a system of independent states refraining from interfering in each other's domestic affairs, and they checked ambitions through law and through what they called an equilibrium of power, which was tempered by international law. And that's more or less what the West operates on. And then, of course, it went too far. Well, not that Westphalia was a great success, because there were many wars since then. And after the Second World War, we had the European Union, which is now beginning to fracture with us leaving. And the UN General Assembly, which is meeting at the moment, but sounding tired, I think, that you know what people are going to say. And the same blocks are going on with Russia saying no to this and America wanting this and everybody wanting to bomb and sanction everybody else. It's sounding a bit tired. So what we're faced with is a sort of unthinkable situation that we could be stumbling, as our forefathers did in the First World War and the Napoleonic Wars or whatever it is, towards something else. And I haven't seen anything or anybody that's sort of suggesting any way to stop it, except saying we don't want a war. But of course, as we know, the human race loves wars because that's what it always does. And if it didn't, it wouldn't do it. We also have another issue where China has come up with an authoritarian regime, non-democratic. Asia is going to be the economic powerhouse of this century and the century beyond. That's undoubtable. It doesn't necessarily mean that liberal democracy in the West is dead. It just means that something else is stronger. And we've done that. But it needs to be accommodated. You can't just say to China, you have to obey international law, when China comes back to you and says, well, you didn't do it there, 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 and there, and by the way, we can blow you out of the water if you cause trouble. You need to stop it all before that happens. China wants a bigger say in the World Bank and the IMF and all that sort of stuff, and there are more big countries like India and Brazil and that want to be on the Security Council of the United Nations. There's a dozen little things that need to be done to bring North Korea into line and all the rest of it. So what I have been doing, quite mischievously, I think, and I gauge the view from this room, every think tank, I said, can you tell me of a big conference that has happened before the war takes place? Why don't we sit them down together, maybe with big screens showing what wars can do, and we know the issues. So instead of having cities turned to rubble and families torn apart, work it out before the war. There has been a precedent to this, and that is in what is now the World Trade Organization, or it began as the Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, known as GATT, which started, I think, in 1947, and is still essentially going on. And so it's taken 70 years of constant regeneration and change, but it's had a forum in which to do that. And if a forum could be created now, essentially, you don't call it to stop the next war, but I thought maybe let's look at a Treaty of Westphalia, because if Asia wins the war or China wins the war, that will be the treaty that will be brokered. But we want to do it before our cities and their cities are destroyed. And with that thought, I'll leave you, and thank you very much for your time.